In September of 1820, according to the story, a man named Robert Gibbon Johnson climbed the steps of the courthouse in Salem, New Jersey, holding a basket of tomatoes. A crowd gathered because word had spread he intended to eat one in public. Tomatoes were widely believed to be poison. People expected him to die. He ate the whole basket. He didn't die, and American fear of the tomato ended that afternoon. It's a great story. It has a hero, a crowd, a courthouse, and a clean ending. It also never happened. Nobody wrote it down for 90 years. The first person to tell it was a postmaster. The version most people know comes from a 1949 radio drama. So if that's not what ended 200 years of tomato fear, what did? That's the actual story. It involves a barber, a family of poisonous plants, some very expensive dinnerware, and a con man who sold tomatoes as medicine. Pull up a chair. The tomato is originally from South America. The Aztecs grew it and ate it and called it tomato. When Spanish conquistadors came back from Mexico in the early 1500s, they brought tomato seeds to southern Europe. For decades, almost nobody ate them. Europeans grew tomatoes as a garden curiosity, the way you'd grow a strange flower. Nobody put one on a plate. In 1544, an Italian herbalist named Pietro Andrea Mattioli tried to classify the plant in print. He put it in the same family as the mandrake, a plant with a long reputation as an aphrodisiac. That's where the tomato picked up its early nickname, the love apple. Interesting, a little scandalous, and not something a respectable household served for dinner. The bigger problem was its family tree. The tomato belongs to the nightshade family. So does deadly nightshade, the plant. So does henbane. So does datura. All three can kill you. The tomato plant's leaves and stems do contain a mild toxin, though the fruit itself doesn't. 16th century botanists didn't know that distinction, and the tomato's small red berries looked enough like deadly nightshades that nobody wanted to find out the hard way. Europe's most educated botanists looked at a food related to a poison and decided that was reason enough to leave it alone. In 1597, an English barber-surgeon named John Gerard published a book called Herbal. It became the standard reference on plants in England for generations. Gerard's entry on the tomato was mostly copied from earlier continental botanists, and the information he copied was already shaky. His own verdict was blunt. He called the whole plant, quote, of rank and stinking savor. The fruit, he said, was corrupt, and he left it to every man's judgment whether to eat it. He was telling them not to. A few decades later, an English translation of a French farming guide put it even more plainly. Eating the fruit, it said, provoketh loathing and vomiting. That's it. That's the whole foundation. One barber surgeon, cribbing secondhand notes, calling a fruit stinking in a book people trusted. No experiment, no outbreak, no science. Just an opinion, printed once and repeated for more than 200 years, in England and later in England's American colonies. By the 1700s, there's a popular explanation for why rich Europeans specifically seemed to get sick after eating tomatoes. Wealthy households ate off pewter plates, and pewter in that period had a lot of lead in it. Tomatoes are acidic. Acid pulls lead out of pewter, so the story goes, aristocrats got lead poisoning from their plates, blamed the tomato sitting on top of them, and poor people, eating off wood, never had the problem. It's a satisfying story. It's also probably not quite right. Chemists who've actually run the numbers say the amount of lead you'd pull out of a plate during one meal is too small to make anyone visibly sick. The more likely explanation is the simpler one. Tomatoes looked like deadly nightshade berries, and that was enough. Which means the modern explanation for the old myth might itself be a tidier myth stacked on top of the first one. Even debunking this thing takes some debunking. While English botanists were writing warnings, Italy was doing something else with the same fruit, cooking it. Southern Europe adopted the tomato far earlier and far more enthusiastically than Britain did. By around 1880, tomato was central to the new dish rising out of Naples, pizza. Notice who was afraid and who wasn't. Fear tracked with wealth and status, not with the food itself. The households reading imported herbals and eating off pewter were the ones avoiding tomatoes. The households who didn't have access to that expert opinion or didn't care about it were the ones already eating dinner. In the American colonies, the earliest written mention of tomatoes being grown is from 1710 in the Carolinas, likely by way of Caribbean and Spanish trade routes that had nothing to do with an English barber-surgeon's opinion. And in Williamsburg, Virginia, in the mid-1700s, a Portuguese physician named John de Sequeira reportedly believed daily tomatoes promoted health and long life, and is credited with introducing them to the region as food, not decoration. Thomas Jefferson grew tomatoes at Monticello from at least 1809 to 1824, one of hundreds of vegetable varieties he experimented with over his life. In 1806, he served tomatoes to guests at the president's house. At the time, that was still a mildly daring thing to put on a formal table. It's a strange loop. The same class of people whose trust in imported expert opinion had kept the tomato off American tables eventually produces the fruit's most famous early champion, a sitting president, while households further from that expert opinion had likely never really stopped eating it. By the early 1800s, tomato recipes were showing up regularly in newspapers and farm periodicals. The fear was fading on its own, unevenly, the way fears usually do. There was no single moment where the country changed its mind. But a single moment makes a better story than a slow fade, and that's likely why Robert Gibbon Johnson's courthouse stunt got invented. Johnson was real. He was a prominent horticulturalist in Salem County, and he probably did help popularize tomato growing there around 1820. But the dramatic public tomato eating in front of a terrified crowd doesn't appear in any record from 1820. It shows up around 1908, told by a local postmaster named Joseph Sickler. It got expanded with invented dialogue in a 1946 history book. Then, in 1949, CBS Radio dramatized it for a show called You Are There, with Sickler consulting, and that's the version that stuck. So the story America tells about the moment it stopped fearing the tomato is itself a myth, manufactured for radio, about 130 years after it supposedly took place. In 1834, an Ohio physician named John Cook Bennett announced that tomatoes cured diarrhea, dyspepsia, and what were then called bilious attacks. His recipes ran in newspapers. A traveling merchant named Archibald Miles took notice. He'd previously sold a patent medicine called the American Hygiene Pill. In 1837, he met Bennett, rebranded, and started selling something called Dr. Miles' Compound Extract of Tomato. Miles was not a doctor. He'd never been one. He just liked the sound of it. For about 15 years, tomato extract was marketed as a cure for jaundice, rheumatism, coughs, and headaches. Then the fad faded, the way patent medicine fads do, and people mostly settled into just eating tomatoes as food. If you're looking for the real turning point in this story, it isn't a courthouse. It's a decade and a half where an entire country decided a completely ordinary vegetable was simultaneously deadly poison and a miracle cure, and neither one was true. In the 1830s, a large green caterpillar started showing up in American tomato patches. It's called the tomato hornworm. It's 3 or 4 inches long, with a small horn on its back, and it looks alarming. People believed it was venomous, that brushing against it could kill you, and that it could poison the fruit just by crawling on it. It's completely harmless. It eats leaves. That's the whole threat. Even after the tomato itself stopped being the villain, Americans found a new thing on the tomato plant to be afraid of. In 1886, a produce importer named John Nix brought a shipment of tomatoes into New York from the West Indies. Under the tariff law at the time, imported vegetables were taxed and imported fruit wasn't. The customs collector charged him the vegetable tax. Nick sued to get it back, arguing that a tomato is, botanically, a fruit. In 1893, the Supreme Court ruled against him, unanimously. The court said tariff law isn't about botany, it's about how people actually talk. Tomatoes get served with dinner, not as dessert, the same way potatoes and cabbage do. In the ordinary language of people buying and selling food, that makes it a vegetable. Botanically, nothing changed. The tomato is still a fruit. But legally, in the United States, by unanimous decision of the highest court in the country, it's a vegetable. That's still the answer today if you ask customs. Between 1880 and 1910, roughly 4 million people emigrated from southern Italy to the United States. They brought their cooking with them. In 1905, a man named Gennaro Lombardi opened what's generally recognized as the first pizzeria in America, in New York City. Within a decade, tomato pie shops were opening across Italian immigrant neighborhoods: Trenton, Utica, Chicago, New Haven. Spaghetti with tomato sauce became one of the first Italian dishes to cross over into wider American eating because it was cheap, it traveled well, and it was genuinely good. Here's the part worth sitting with. The tomato that wealthy, well-read Europeans were too nervous to touch became, within a few generations, the signature ingredient of food made by immigrants that polite society looked down on. And then everyone wanted it. In 1897, Joseph Campbell figured out how to can tomatoes well and built a business around condensed tomato soup, turning New Jersey into one of the country's major tomato-growing states. Back in 1876, Henry Heinz had already launched his tomato ketchup, made with very ripe tomatoes that preserve naturally, undercutting competitors who used chemical preservatives and unripe fruit. By 1907, Heinz was making about 12 million bottles a year and shipping them to 4 continents. Between the soup can and the ketchup bottle, the tomato stopped being a seasonal garden curiosity and became something closer to a permanent fixture. Something that was just always there. The tomato never changed. It was never poison. It was never a miracle drug. It never had a real legal identity crisis, just a tariff dispute settled by 9 men in robes. Every turn in this story is about people, not the fruit. A barber-surgeon